Imagine sitting alone at a kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night, the only light coming from a small lamp above the stove, and in front of you, there's an envelope you already know you don't want to open. You know the shape of it. You know the little plastic window where your name shows through. You know, before you even touch it, that it's another hospital bill. You're 74 years old. Your hands? The same hands that spent 40 years pulling wire through conduit and reading blueprints under fluorescent lights in a steel plant outside Pittsburgh, are shaking now. Not from age, not really, but from something closer to dread. You open the envelope anyway, because not opening it has never once made a bill disappear. The number at the bottom is bigger than you expected. It's always bigger than you expected. You look around the kitchen, your wife's reading glasses are still on the counter, exactly where she left them 14 months ago. You haven't moved them. You haven't been able to. And in that kitchen, under that small yellow light, you look down at your own left hand and you realize there's only one thing left in this house that's worth enough money to make a difference. Your wedding ring. 46 years of marriage, sitting on a fourth finger that's grown thinner with age, and you're doing the math in your head like it's just another object. Like it's not the last physical piece of a promise you made in a church in 1979. That's the moment this story really begins. Not with the diagnosis, not with the funeral, with a kitchen table, an envelope, and a decision that felt like losing your wife a second time. My name is Thomas Reynolds, and this is the story of how I ended up 10,000 miles from the only home I ever knew, on a beach in the Philippines. Finally learning that letting go of what's behind you doesn't mean forgetting it. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and let us know in the comments which country you're watching from. I want to take you back further, before the bills, before the hospital, before any of it, because you can't understand what Dumaguete gave me until you understand what Pittsburgh took away, piece by piece, over the better part of 2 years. I was born in 1952 in a small house near Homestead, Pennsylvania, close enough to the steel mills that the sound of them was just part of the background noise of childhood, like crickets or traffic. My father worked the mills his whole life. He used to say a man's worth was measured by what he built, not what he talked about. I believe that for most of my life, and something quieter than that, a sense of motion, a sense that my life, which had felt frozen since Margaret's diagnosis, was moving again, even if I didn't yet know toward what. Harold met me at the airport in Dumaguete, and the humidity hit me like a wall the moment I stepped outside the terminal. Thick, warm, smelling faintly of the sea and diesel, and something sweet I couldn't identify, which I later learned was likely the scent of ripe mangoes being sold by a vendor near the taxi stand. The drive from the airport to Harold's rented house took maybe 20 minutes, along a coastal road with the Bohol Sea visible in flashes between buildings and palm trees. I remember being struck almost immediately by how alive everything felt. Motorbikes weaving between cars, small shops with hand-painted signs, children playing in the street who waved at our taxi without any hesitation, as if a stranger passing through was a cause for celebration rather than suspicion. Harold's rented house was modest, but comfortable. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a porch facing a garden with a mango tree that Harold said had been planted by the previous tenant a decade earlier. The guest room had a simple bed, a ceiling fan, and a window that looked out toward a narrow side street where a woman sold fresh bread from a cart every morning around 6. That first night, jet-lagged and disoriented, I lay awake listening to sounds I'd never heard before. Roosters, though it wasn't yet dawn. Distant motorbike engines, the occasional bark of a dog, and underneath it all, a low, constant hum of insects that I found oddly comforting rather than annoying. The next morning, Harold took me to a small cafe near the Rizal Boulevard, a stretch of waterfront promenade where locals and a small number of foreign retirees gathered in the early morning to walk, exercise, or simply sit and watch the sea. We ordered coffee, strong, sweet, served with a small plate of what Harold called pan de sal, a soft bread roll that I ended up eating almost every morning for the rest of my stay. I remember sitting there, watching fishing boats head out for the day, an older Filipino man doing slow Tai Chi-like stretches near the seawall, and feeling, for the first time in longer than I could remember, that I was simply a person sitting somewhere pleasant, with no bills waiting on a kitchen table, no medical appointments looming, no reminders at every turn of what I'd lost. That's not to say the grief disappeared. it didn't. I thought about Margaret constantly during that trip, wondering what she would have thought of the food, imagining her laughing at my clumsy attempts to bargain at a local market, missing her specifically and acutely in moments of beauty. The way grief often sharpens rather than dulls when you experience something wonderful the person you loved never got to see. But there was space, for the first time, between the grief and the rest of my life. Room to breathe, room to notice something other than loss. I don't want to paint an unrealistically rosy picture. There were adjustments, some easy, some harder. The heat, for one, took real getting used to. Pittsburgh winters had been part of my life for 74 years, and stepping outside every morning into thick, humid air that never really cooled down, even at night, left me sweating through shirts in a way that embarrassed me at first. Harold laughed and told me it took him almost a full year to stop noticing it, and that eventually my body would adjust. He was right, though it took longer than I expected. Closer to 2 months before I stopped feeling like I was walking through soup every time I left the house. Then there was the language. Most people in Dumaguete spoke at least some English, often quite fluently, which made day-to-day life easier than I'd expected. But the local language, Cebuano, was spoken constantly around me, in the markets, between neighbors, on the jeepneys that rattled down the main roads packed with passengers. I felt at times like a guest standing just outside a conversation, and I didn't love that feeling. Harold told me not to worry about mastering it, just to learn a few phrases out of respect, and let the rest come naturally over time. I learned to say thank you, salamat, and good morning, maayong buntag, within my first week, and I noticed something small but important. People's faces would light up a little whenever I used them, even badly. There was no mockery in their laughter when I mispronounced something, just warmth. The food took adjustment too. I'd been a meat and potatoes man my whole life, the kind of guy who considered a good pot roast the height of culinary achievement. Filipino food was different. Rice with nearly every meal, dishes built around vinegar and garlic, and something called patis that Harold explained was a kind of fish sauce. I was skeptical the first time I tried adobo, a dish of chicken or pork stewed in vinegar, soy sauce, and garlic. But by the end of my second week, I was asking the woman at a small carinderia, a kind of local eatery, for seconds. But it was the small victories that stayed with me longest. There was the afternoon I successfully bargained for a woven basket at the public market, dropping the price by nearly a third, through nothing but patient smiling and a few words of broken Cebuano, and the vendor, an older woman with a gap-toothed grin, laughed and shook my hand like we'd just closed a business deal worth millions. There was the morning I navigated a jeepney route entirely on my own, without Harold, and managed not only to get where I was going, but to pay the correct fare without fumbling for change like a confused tourist. Small things. But at 74 years old, discovering you can still learn, still adapt, still figure out a completely unfamiliar world, that does something to a man's sense of himself that I hadn't expected. There's one afternoon from that first trip I think about more than almost any other, and it's the one I want to tell you about now, because it's the moment everything I'd been carrying finally came into focus. Harold and I had taken a short drive to a quiet stretch of coastline south of the city, a beach that wasn't crowded with tourists, mostly just a few local families and fishermen mending nets near the shore. Harold, sensing maybe that I needed a little space, wandered off to talk to a fisherman he apparently knew from previous visits, and I found myself walking alone along the waterline, the warm surf rolling over my bare feet. The late afternoon sun turning the water a shade of gold I don't think I'd ever seen back home. I don't know exactly what made me look down at my left hand in that moment. Maybe it was the water. Maybe it was simply the stillness. The first real stillness I'd felt in over 2 years. But I looked down, and there it was. The pale strip of skin on my fourth finger, still faintly visible even after all these months, where a ring used to sit for 46 years. I stopped walking. I stood there in the surf, and for the first time since that jeweler's shop, I let myself really feel what I'd done. I hadn't just paid off a debt. I'd made a choice, a hard and necessary one, to let go of an object in order to survive. And standing there, with the Bohol Sea moving gently around my ankles, I finally understood something I hadn't been able to see clearly back home, surrounded by bills and empty rooms and a kitchen table full of ghosts. The ring was never the marriage. It was never Margaret. It was a symbol, a beautiful, important symbol, but a symbol all the same. Margaret herself lived somewhere else entirely. She lived in the specific way I still instinctively reached for a second coffee cup, some mornings before remembering. She lived in the sound of her laugh that I could still hear clearly if I closed my eyes. She lived in 46 years of a life we built together. A life that no jeweler, no hospital bill, no financial hardship could ever actually take from me. Because it didn't exist in a piece of gold. It existed in me. I stood in that water for a long time. Long enough that Harold eventually wandered back over, took one look at my face, and simply put a hand on my shoulder without saying anything. He didn't ask what was wrong. I think, as a man who'd lost his own wife suddenly and carried his own grief across an ocean, he understood exactly what that silence meant. "You okay, Tom?" he finally asked quietly. "I think so," I told him. And for the first time since Margaret's diagnosis, I actually believed it when I said it. We stood there together as the sun started to lower toward the water. Two old men who'd both lost the center of their worlds, finding something unexpected on a beach on the other side of the planet. Not an answer to grief, because I don't think grief ever fully resolves into an answer, but a way to carry it that didn't feel like drowning. I flew back to Pittsburgh 2 days later, and something had shifted in me that I couldn't quite explain to Karen or Michael when they picked me up from the airport. They asked about the trip, about the food, about the weather, and I answered all their questions, but I found myself unable to fully articulate the thing that had actually changed. It wasn't until I was back in my own kitchen, sitting at that same table, looking at that same lamp, that I understood it clearly. The house that had once felt like the last remaining container of my marriage now felt, oddly, like a museum, a place preserving grief rather than housing a life. Margaret's reading glasses were still on the counter. Her side of the closet was still full of clothes I hadn't been able to sort through. Every surface in that house held a memory, but very few of them held me, the person I might still become. In Dumaguete, for 2 weeks, I hadn't been the widower down the street, or the guy whose wife died of cancer. I'd simply been Tom, a curious, occasionally clumsy, occasionally homesick American, learning to bargain at markets and say good morning in a language that wasn't his own. There was a strange kind of freedom in that anonymity, not because I wanted to forget Margaret, but because I finally had room to exist as something other than a grieving man. I spent the following several months back in Pittsburgh in a state of quiet reconsideration. I talked with Karen and Michael, carefully, honestly, about what I was thinking. Karen worried, as she always does, mostly about my health and my distance from family if something went wrong. Michael, true to his quieter nature, mostly just asked practical questions. How would healthcare work? What would I do with the house? Could I really afford it long term? I didn't have every answer, but I had, for the first time in 2 years, a direction. I put my house on the market in the autumn of that year, nearly 18 months after Margaret passed. It sold faster than I expected. The market in that part of Pittsburgh had picked up, and a young couple with their first child made an offer within 3 weeks. Standing in the empty living room on the final walkthrough, stripped of furniture, stripped of the small, accumulated evidence of 40 years of a shared life, I expected to feel devastated. Instead, I felt something closer to release. I sorted through decades of belongings with Karen's help over several difficult but important weekends, donating most of the furniture, giving Karen and Michael whatever pieces of their mother's jewelry and belongings they wanted to keep, and shipping only a small handful of boxes ahead of me to the Philippines. A few photographs, Margaret's favorite sweater, which still faintly smelled like her perfume if I pressed my face into it just right. A small wooden box that had belonged to my father, one of the only things of his I still owned. I did not and could not buy back the ring. The jeweler had already sold it, likely melted down and reshaped into something else entirely by the time I even considered it. I made peace, slowly, with the fact that it was simply gone, the way so much of a life eventually becomes gone, replaced not by nothing, but by memory, and if you're fortunate, by something new growing up around the empty space it leaves. I moved to Dumaguete permanently the following spring, almost exactly 2 years after Margaret's death. Harold helped me find a small rented house not far from his own, modest but bright, with a covered porch and a small garden where, within my first month, I'd already planted tomatoes and a stubborn little chili plant that seemed determined to grow, despite my complete lack of gardening experience. The adjustment wasn't instant or magical. There were homesick nights, particularly around what would have been Margaret's birthday, and around the anniversary of her passing, when the distance from her grave felt suddenly, sharply unbearable, and I questioned whether I'd made a mistake putting an ocean between myself and the one place that still held physical evidence of her existence. But there were also mornings on the porch with coffee and pandesal, watching the mango tree Harold had shown me on my very first visit slowly grow heavier with fruit. There were friendships I never expected to make at 75 years old. A retired Australian schoolteacher named Colin, who lived 2 streets over and had a similarly dry sense of humor to Harold's. A Filipino family who ran the small carinderia near my house, who began setting aside my favorite dish before I even ordered it, treating me, within a matter of months, like an uncle who'd simply been away for a long time, rather than a stranger from another country. I found a rhythm to life I hadn't expected to find again. Mornings for walks along Rizal Boulevard, afternoons for small errands, gardening, occasional volunteer work, teaching basic electrical safety to local trade students at a vocational school, something that gave me an unexpected sense of purpose, using 41 years of hard-won knowledge to help young men just starting out in a trade I'd spent my whole life inside of. Evenings, more often than not, spent on Harold's porch or mine, talking about our wives, our regrets, our unexpected second chapters, sharing a beer as the sky turned the same gold color I'd seen on that beach during my very first visit. It's been almost 3 years now since that Tuesday I stood in Harold Whitfield's kitchen for the first time and asked him, half joking, what in the world could possibly take a Pittsburgh boy to the Philippines. I know the answer now, though it took me the better part of 2 years and 10,000 miles to understand it fully. It was never really about the Philippines. It was about permission. Permission to keep living fully after loss. Permission to build something new without it being a betrayal of something old. Permission to let an object go without letting go of what that object represented. I still think about Margaret every single day. I think about her when the light hits the water outside my porch at a certain angle in the late afternoon, the same way it did through that hospital window the morning she passed. I think about her when I successfully bargain at the market, imagining her laughing at how proud I get over saving the equivalent of 50 cents. I think about her especially on quiet evenings when the porch is empty and the mango tree rustles slightly in the breeze, and I let myself simply miss her without trying to fix the feeling or rush past it. But I don't carry that grief the way I did at that kitchen table in Pittsburgh, with an envelope in my hand and a ring I was about to lose. I carry it the way you carry something you love, heavy sometimes, lighter other times, but always still with you. Selling that ring felt, for a long time, like the worst thing I ever did. Looking back now, from a porch on the other side of the world, I understand it differently. It wasn't the end of my marriage to Margaret. It was the last, hardest thing I did as a grieving husband before I could start becoming, again, simply a man, one who still loved deeply, who still carried 46 years of a beautiful life inside him, but who also finally had room left over to keep living it. If you're sitting somewhere tonight with your own envelope, your own impossible decision, your own object you can't imagine parting with, I won't tell you it gets easy. But I will tell you this. Growing older with dignity doesn't mean refusing to change. Sometimes it means having the courage to let one chapter close so gently that you barely notice a new one has already begun.
Clearance sale, everything must go.
Keep moving. Watch your step.
Tabing daan lang po.
Sariwang isda, bili na kayo. 60 pesos lang, subukan nyo. Sa murang halaga. Tara, kain na tayo ng barbecue.
Dalawa po. much for the mangoes?
50 pesos, sir.
50 pesos each. Very sweet.
I will take 3.
Check out the crew getting ready to dock. We should be on the sand in just a few minutes.
Magkano po yung ihaw?
30 lang, sir. Bagong luto.
Dalawa nga po. Magkano po itong fishball? 10 piso lang. Isa pa, mainit pa. Ang daming tao dito sa Divisoria ngayon.
Saan ba yon?
Dito po ma'am, tingnan nyo to. Ang gulo naman.
We should take a break soon. Yes, the sun is high already.
Look at this quality, the best in Davao.
Wow, it smells so strong.
Isa pa, chip. Bagong luto.
Masarap to, subukan mo.
is moving pretty fast now. We just got our life vests from the ranger, and we're ready to head into the darkness. Freshly grilled, come and get your barbecue skewers.
How much for 3?
Coming through, watch your back.
Magkano po itong isda? Ay, sariwa pa yan, dalawa na. Saan ba yung jeepney stop?
Clearance sale, everything must go.
Keep moving, watch your step.
Tabing daan lang po.
Sariwang isda, bili na kayo. 60 pesos lang, subukan nyo. Sa murang halaga. Tara, kain na tayo ng barbecue.
Dalawa po.
How much for the mangoes?
50 pesos, sir.
50 pesos each. Very sweet.
I will take 3.
Check out the crew getting ready to dock. We should be on the sand in just a few minutes.
Magkano po yung ihaw?
30 lang, sir. Bagong luto.
Dalawa nga po. Magkano po itong fishball? 10 piso lang, isa pa mainit pa. Ang daming tao dito sa Divisoria ngayon. Dito po ma'am, tingnan nyo to. Ang gulo naman.
We should take a break soon. Yes, the sun is high already.
Look at this quality, the best in Davao.
Wow, it smells so strong.
Isa pa, Chip. Bagong luto.
Masarap to, subukan mo.
The line is moving pretty fast now. We just got our life vests from the ranger and we're ready to head into the darkness.